The 9800X3D is regarded as the current fastest desktop gaming CPU. Naturally, I wanted one, and about a week ago I got one. Was it worth it though? I'll let you be the judge as we explore this question in this video, but I'd have to say that not really. Let me explain. I already had a 7800X3D anyway, so how does the 9800X3D compare to it? What about a Ryzen 5900X? Well, let's explore a few modern games together, and you guys share your thoughts in the comment section. Let me know if it's worth it. We're going to start with Baldurs Gate 3 in Baldurs Gate City, an area that's well known to be quite CPU demanding, although there is other areas in the game that can be a bit CPU demanding, but this is a big one, and it's a very lively city. You can kind of understand why. For this benchmark, I made sure that we are CPU bound, and on the left we're going to have the 9800X3D, and on the right we have the 7800X3D. And you can already see that the 9800X3D actually is quite noticeably faster here. How much faster? Well, at the end of the benchmark run, I had 138 FPS average for the 9800 versus 107 FPS average for the 7800. So that is an advantage of 30% faster average FPS for the 9800X3D. And for 1% lows, it was a little bit less, 85 FPS, 1% lows for the 9800 versus 76 1% lows for the 7800. That's an advantage of around 12% faster. So not a massive difference. If it wasn't for having a channel and I can get more out of the CPU, I probably wouldn't have upgraded, if I'm being honest. I mostly play single player games and some multiplayer games, co-op mostly here and there. I think the 7800X3D would be fine enough. But what if you had an older CPU, like a Ryzen 5000, for example? Well, let's take a look. So what I did was I took my Ryzen 5900X and ran through this area again, and this is where we saw massive gains, guys. We had 138 FPS average on the 9800X3D. On the 5900X, we had 75 FPS. So the 9800X3D was 84% faster on the average FPS, and for 1% lows, we had 85 FPS, and on the 5900X, we got 51 FPS. So the 9800X3D is 65% ahead on the 1% lows, which is very, very nice, of course. And on top of it all, it's also consuming considerably less power, as you can see in the metrics at the top. So that is this would most definitely be a very worthy upgrade that you would definitely notice in CPU bound scenarios, of course. The next game we'll take a look at is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, Vatican City to be specific, because it can be a bit of a CPU heavy area, and this is a technical showcase of the best that PC gaming has to offer with path tracing and ray tracing. Path tracing can actually add a bit more of a low tier CPU as well, by the way, which we're gonna take a look at in here as well. And thanks to Nvidia, by the way, for giving me a copy of the Steam version of the game so that we can take a look at it together. So let's go ahead and do that. The 7800X3D will be first, which is on the right. This was just sort of a short walk across the Vatican courtyard and over to a checkpoint. And here the differences were a little bit smaller. We had 90 average FPS on the 9800X3D versus 78 average on the 7800X3D. That is a lead of 16% for average FPS. And for 1% lows, we had 74 on the 9800X3D versus 63 on the 7800X3D. That's an advantage of 18%. So nothing too crazy. And yeah, the game looks absolutely phenomenal, by the way. And I've made sure that we are consistently CPU bound here. That's why I'm not going over the settings or what GPU I'm using. Even though you can see it, it's not really the point of the video, right? We are focused on the CPU performance and the advantages of the CPUs that we're taking a look at here. So yeah, the advantage between the two here is not really all that noticeable. I would say it's a bit on the low side. But what about 5900X? Well, the 5900X can't even maintain average 60 FPS in this area. As a matter of fact, it's 53 FPS average. That is a lead of 70% for the 9800X3D. And for 1% lows, the 5900X drops all the way down to 45. That is a lead of 65% for the 9800X 3D. And that is, of course, with path tracing and everything maxed out. So it goes to show that these newer AAA games are not just more CPU demanding, which is something that you do expect. Obviously, games do become more and more demanding CPU and GPU, by the way, but a bit more so with some newer games. And then you also have ray tracing and path tracing on top of that. That can make your game a bit more demanding on the CPU and obviously on the GPU. That goes without saying. I just feel that the CPUs have kind of stagnated a little bit, whereas GPUs have gotten faster and faster. And now with the 5090 around the corner, I mean, here it is, 9800X 3D. It's the best you can get at the moment, caps at 100 FPS. But what is the cost of path tracing on the CPU? Well, if we take a look at the 9800X 3D with path tracing on the left and path tracing off on the right, you can already see the difference in performance. It's quite high. We're CPU bound on both sides, right? And we're average 90 FPS with path tracing enabled, 167 FPS with path tracing disabled, and 1% lows, 74 with path tracing maxed out, 116 FPS with path tracing completely disabled. Although the game does have ray trace global illumination, which is set to supreme, obviously maxed out by default. But yeah, those are the differences. So I would say this is a bit on the high side versus some other games that I've looked at that have path tracing. So it must depend on the engine and how they're doing it. But needless to say, you know, you do need quite a capable CPU if you want to take advantage of some of these latest cutting edge technologies that are available on PC. But this was kind of interesting. What about the 5900X? Can that go beyond 60 FPS with path tracing disabled? Well, clearly, as you can see, it can. Funny enough, actually, the numbers that we're getting with path tracing disabled on the Ryzen 5900X is very similar, almost closely identical to what we were getting on the 9800X 3D with path tracing maxed out. But yeah, as you can see, we're averaging 96 FPS with path tracing off versus 53 average FPS with path tracing maxed out on the 5900X. And for 1% lows, we go from 45 FPS with path tracing on to 69 FPS giggity with path tracing off on the 5900X. So yeah, guys, quite a bit of a cost to the CPU alone. This is not factoring in the GPU performance, obviously. That's kind of the point of these tests, but very interesting stuff indeed. I hadn't looked at this game yet, so yeah, this was quite interesting. But anyway, I think you all get the idea. Let's take a look at another game or two, and then we'll wrap up the video. The next game I want to take a look at is Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2, a well-known game for being very, very CPU demanding. And we're going to start with the 7800X 3D first. This is about close to halfway through the first mission, and you essentially have to hold the line while the Marines are opening the door. There's a lot of enemies coming. That's why I kind of chose this spot, although there's other areas that can be more CPU demanding, like towards the end of Chapter 1, but that's besides the point. For this one here, we had a pretty decent advantage for the 9800X 3D on the average FPS, which was 145 for the 9800X 3D and 114 for the 7800X 3D. So that's about a 27% lead for the 9800X 3D on the average FPS. Now on the 1% lows, however, the difference was much smaller. So we had 90 FPS for 1% lows on the 9800X 3D versus 83 FPS on the 7800X 3D for a lead of around 9% in favor of the 9800X 3D, of course. So yeah, 1% low is actually 7800X 3D did really, really well. So yeah, this was a pretty long mission, and again, these missions can vary because depends how you approach it. So it's not, you can never do a like exact replica, which is usually what I aim and try to do, but I think it's close enough. So yeah, I would say it's a pretty decent advantage over the 7800X 3D, but nothing massive, right? Now, what about the 5900X? Well, the difference is much bigger, obviously, than the 7800X 3D, but still, 5900X was able to average 79 FPS versus the 145 on the 9800X 3D. Yeah, that is a pretty big gap. As a matter of fact, it's a 84% advantage on the averages for the 9800X 3D. And for 1% lows, the 5900X was able to hold on to 60 at the very least, versus the 90 that we got on the 9800X 3D in the same very area, which leads to 50% advantage on the 1% lows. So yeah, I mean, a game like this, 9800X 3D is pretty much a godsend, right? Because this game is very, very CPU intensive, and while this isn't technically the most demanding area in the game, obviously there's other areas probably that are a little bit more demanding, but it is a demanding area nonetheless. There's a lot of enemies that you're fighting, friendly NPCs and all that stuff. So yeah, I think the 5900X did a little bit better than I thought it would have, right? But yeah, these are the numbers, guys. Games like this, you will notice that extra CPU power. For the next game, let's go ahead and take a look at Stalker 2. I didn't capture any Ryzen 5900X footage for this one, but we do have some interesting 7800X 3D and 9800X 3D footage of Stalker 2. Is quite CPU heavy in general, but especially the outpost areas. And the outpost we're going to look at is Slag Heap, which is the second outpost you go to. It is one of the more demanding ones because there's a lot more NPCs than a lot of the other ones that are a bit smaller. So it's a good testing ground. So let's take a look. In Stalker 2, we actually saw the 9800X 3D pull quite ahead from the 7800X 3D. One of the better examples that I've seen so far anyway. It's only had the CPU for about a week, but we had a 26% advantage on the average FPS. So 97 FPS versus 77 FPS on the 7800X 3D. And for 1% lows, it was about the same, 26%. 53 FPS, 1% lows on the 9800X 3D versus 42 on the 7800X 3D. So yeah, guys, Stalker 2 can be quite CPU heavy. Open world is not so bad, but these towns can be quite CPU heavy. And I hope that this doesn't become a trend for Unreal Engine 5 open world games, by the way. I hope so, because, I mean, I've took a look at the game on my Ryzen 5900X, and these town areas, you drop well below 60 FPS, and that's just kind of crazy. Especially if you look at Indiana Jones, right? Where we had path tracing and all these crazy graphic settings enabled, and we were able to run in the 60s at the very least. So yeah, I hope this doesn't become a trend. Now, I've heard that Intel CPUs do a bit better in this game. I don't have an Intel CPU. My buddy over at Mostly Positive Reviews does, and I believe he's done a test between 7800X 3D and 14700K. I believe that's what he has. And yeah, Intel actually can do a bit better with the frame times and 1% lows in this game. But yeah, 9800X 3D does noticeably better here. Let's move on. Next, we'll take a quick look at Dragon Age the Veilguard, and regardless of how you may feel about the game, it's actually quite interesting from a benchmarking perspective because it is a CPU-heavy game, but even more so when enabling ray tracing, and that's what we're going to focus on, is ray tracing enabled. Dragon Age the Veilguard was pretty much the opposite of Stalker 2. Maybe even one of the more interesting games that we've looked at so far. Now, on the averages, it was only 13% lead for the 9800X 3D, 103 versus 91 FPS. But on the 1% lows, it was pretty much within margin of error because we had 68 FPS on the 9800X 3D and 70 on the 7800X 3D. So the 7800X 3D was 2% faster, actually, on the 1% lows, but that could be because of the fighting sequences, you know, depending on what type of spells you use, that can affect the things. But Dragon Age Veilguard is actually, I would say that it's a very well optimized game as far as frame time goes. It's very extremely smooth. I mean, you can see how close the 1% lows are to the averages when compared to other games, especially. Now, yes, when you enable ray tracing, the game does become significantly more CPU heavy. And I did a video, actually, where we looked at how modern games affect CPU performance, sometimes even with graphical settings like ray tracing and path tracing. And that can also depend on the type of engine. So Unreal Engine 5 actually seems to have been designed with ray tracing and maybe even path tracing in mind, whereas some of these proprietary engines affect the CPU quite a bit. Another good engine is CD Projekt's Red engine, which they're getting rid of for some reason and going with UE5. So that sucks. But anyway, how does the Ryzen 5900X compare? 5900X actually does all right. I mean, it averages close to 65 pretty much. And for 1% lows, it's at 49. Now, yes, the 9800X is significantly faster, 60% faster on averages, and 40% faster on 1% lows. But all things considered, I think 5900X does surprisingly well. But yeah, I would say a 9800X 3D is a very worthy upgrade from a Ryzen 5900X. But then again, you would have to get a new motherboard and everything like that. So it's not cheap. It would cost you at least 600 bucks. If not 700 or 800. But anyway, I guess to wrap up this video, right? Because it's getting way too long, and I even captured footage of a few other games as well. So I'll just insert those clips here so you guys can take a look at them. But I guess to share my thoughts, do I think it's worth it? Am I happy with the upgrade? I mean, yeah, I am happy. It's a very fast gaming CPU, and I do notice that it's a bit better in 1% low, so it's a bit smoother. But I think if you have a 7800X 3D or a 14900K or 14700K, I don't think it's really necessary unless you plan on getting one of the next gen GPUs, right? That is going to need as fast of a CPU. As a matter of fact, I think for the 5090 and 9800X 3D is going to become a bottleneck fairly frequently, because it becomes a bottleneck even for my 4090 sometimes, right? So technically it is the fastest gaming CPU. So yeah, but I don't think it's necessarily worth it if you already have a very capable CPU. Now for me, well, I can make content out of it and I like to have it, but also what I plan on doing is I plan on building another AM5 rig. All I need is just a motherboard. I have everything else. I have a case, I have RAM, I have a PSU, and then I'm going to do is put my RX 7900X TX with the Ryzen 7800X 3D, and then keep my 4090 with the 9800X 3D. That way when I make GPU comparisons between the two, I don't have to swap them out, because when I compare those two GPUs, it's always at around 4K anyway. It's always a GPU bound scenario that both CPUs are extremely capable. So I think I would stand to benefit. So in that aspect, I do think it's worth it for me. If I wasn't making videos though, probably not. I would just hold on to the 7800X 3D and it would be fine. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Leave a thought down below. Let me know what you think. And yeah, subscribe and like the video. It really helps out. But I'll see you in the next one. And I hope you guys have a great holidays. Merry Christmas if you celebrate. If you don't, hope you have a good time with your family. Enjoy the winter. Eat good food. Get some rest. And play games and have fun. So yeah, I'll see you on the next one. Peace out.